Okay, good evening. We're going to go ahead and get our meeting started. Thank you for being here tonight. Good attendance. We're going to go ahead and jump in. You should have an agenda at your table, and we're going to do our best to stick those timelines so that we can move through our agenda and the work that we need to do as a committee. Doing an update on the audio recording process. I know we had some questions at our last meeting, and also I received some questions throughout the week. So we just wanted to clarify, went back and listened to the presentation that was given to the board, and it was consistent with what we had shared at the meeting. So I just want to reiterate that so everyone's aware of that, because that also the Bay Council uncovered the story, so I want to make sure that you know what was actually said to the board. And so we had said that during presentation time and if there are summary share outs, that those items would be recorded. Anytime there's committee discussion, small group work, that sort of thing, those items would not be recorded. And so we are going to be consistent with that. And again, during the presentations that Mr. Fraley gives, or that I give, or that Dr. McCall gives, or anyone from Goose Creek, that will be recorded. If we have summary share outs from the committee, we'll have that also. We'll let you know when we're not recording, when it's time for committee work or discussion, okay? So we're going to make sure I clarify that. Also, I wanted to just remind everyone, this is a closed meeting. And so what that means when it's a closed meeting, it's different than a board meeting, which is not a closed meeting. Anyone cannot attend this meeting, or the media can't sit in on this meeting, so it is closed. However, we did get the option for audio recording at the beginning, because we know that the media and there's interested citizens who want to follow the progress of what's being covered. And so if you go to the Goose Creek website, we do have our agendas. Well, we don't have this meeting's agenda, but it'll be up there tomorrow or Thursday. But we have our agendas posted on the website, and we also have the large share out presentation audio recording. Okay? So I wanted to just make sure we're good on that. Also wanted to give you a timeline for our meetings. And so again, this is a commitment. We appreciate your commitment. So this is how we are working through the meeting. So you can see that we've knocked out meeting number 1. Today is meeting number 2, December 8th. And then you can just look at those dates. We have 2 meetings in January. And then we have a public online survey, and we will discuss this as we get closer to this event, where we will share committee work up to that point in late January or early February for feedback from the community. And so we do this often with either bond work or with rezoning work, where we share information out, solicit feedback, and then we will meet 1 or 2 times after that. Yes, ma'am?
Question on the audio. Was it up for a vote?
What do you mean?
Well, I noticed that on the audio, it doesn't say people's names or whatever. It just said you had bits and pieces. And when I listened to it, you don't even have a discussion. So how are people informed when you do meet with them, or they know what was said? And not only that, I think we need to take it up for a vote.
It's not up for a vote. It was presented to the board initially on October 27th, and that was the decision. And so we are audio recording the large group share outs, also the presentation piece. We will put information out to the community for feedback. So we will probably, as a committee, work on questions in the form of a survey that people will respond to. So that's how we'll get feedback from the community.
I did have a question about that.
Sure.
Survey, I think it said in the paper that it would be online. Well, there are a lot of people in the community, I mean, very affluent people, who still do not use computers. I mean, there's a well-known dentist that refuses to. And, I mean, I think it's kind of unfair to them that, they're not using it.
So what we can do, and again, as we get closer to late January, when we put out information to the community, we can talk about what exactly we want to put out as a community. We're open to that. And we can do various forms. So if we need to do an online survey, or if we want to do a paper and pen survey where they fill out that information, we'll be glad to do that. And we can post it in the newspaper so that those who read the newspaper can get that feedback. Okay. Any other questions on that piece? Okay, great. So I want to ask Mr. Farley to come up, and we're going to go to our next part of the agenda.
This part, real quick, just a reminder of kind of our team rules. And we have these up here. We will honor the charge, stay focused on what we're here for. As we're talking, we have 42 folks who signed up for this. And we want to try to share the time that's on topic, folks will follow along with where we're going. Positive presuppositions, let's just accept as a fact, or presume the fact, that everyone in this room has the best interest of the students and the community of Goose Creek ISD in mind. Let's just accept that everybody in the room has that. We see the world differently, some see 6, some see 9, but we do have the best interest collectively. That's what we're supposed to consider. Mutual respect, community students is top priority. Between now and our January meeting, there are other ground rules we need to have. Please chop those down, bring those to us. You can click to the next one there. You got it. And the board asked us to have these commitments as well. As you see, last time we talked about the light blue words, we discussed the atmospheric conditions. That's what we see up here with the board's expectations as well. That we have honest and respectful discussion, meaningful conversation. I'm willing to bet that hope that we'll have disagreements. And that's okay. That's okay. Committed to education of all students, developing the whole child. And again, just real quickly, these are the two deliverables we must come up with. These committee outcomes. We've generated some questions, tagged to these. We'll be discussing with you all overall to kind of get all these brought in here. Next one, please. And we're going to begin by talking about how the soldiers were named. There's an interesting history here in Goose Creek that the voters come across that we're ready to share with you all as well. And we'll just answer all these questions and look at, why would we consider this? What are the pros, what are the cons, what's the impact? That's what we're all here about. So we're going to begin with answer the first question about what was the process used to pass the name schools.
Okay. So if you'll take a look at your agenda, so it's pretty ambitious, but we're going to try to work through those first 4 questions. That is our goal, is to move through those first 4 questions. The first one that's listed is how were facilities originally named in Goose Creek CISD. And so this question is really set up for background information, which will lead to an outcome down the road. So what I mean by that is we're going to review how facilities were named, we're going to review a current board policy, and then one of the outcomes that Mr. Friend will share is that if the committee down the road, if we have any recommended feedback from the board on that policy, then that's one of the outcomes. Does that make sense? So this first part is a little lecture-based, but it's to provide background knowledge to just to know where we're at today regarding facility names. Okay? So here's a real quick summary, and this is really the answer to that question. How were facilities originally named in Goose Creek? Well, it's based off the current school board. If there was a policy in place, then the school board would typically follow that policy. Before there was policy, the school board would have a practice of naming schools, and usually that practice was based off of community input. Okay, so that's the short answer to that question. It's a school board decision, typically based off community input. Okay, real quick history of Goose Creek started in 1919. Originally Goose Creek ISD. There was not a C. There were not 2 C's in there initially. It was GC ISD. Served the Tri-Cities of Pelly, Goose Creek, and Baytown. The first building program began in 1921. That was the first bond that was passed. And then in 1954, Goose Creek ISD consolidated with Cedar Bio ISD. It was a separate ISD back in the day. And so that's where that extra C was added, Goose Creek Consolidated ISD. If you have your facilities vision guide, there's a little bit more detail in the introduction of Goose Creek that you can read through if you're interested. So what I wanted to do with the committee, and we'll have this presentation available to you if you want to have access to it. There are 16 elementary or primary schools. I'm trying to find a place to get where I'm not blocking your view. And so, out of these 16 schools, 4 of them are named after locations or concepts. They're not named after individuals. So who can name one of the schools, elementary school, that is named after a location? Okay, San Jacinto, Alamo, Harlem, and Highland. So those are our 4, okay? I just put them up. We-
I got my glasses, so I can.
We have one school that's named after a national figure or a national icon. Does anyone know the name of that school? No, close. So those are state figures or state icons. There's one named after national. I don't know. It's Carver. Okay? Carver. 7 were named after state figures or icons, so we heard several of those. And so I'm going to go ahead and put these up here. This is just background knowledge on how schools were named. Austin, Bowie, Crockett, De Zavala, Lamar, Asheville Smith, and Travis. I was told, I was visiting with a colleague yesterday, and she said that at one point the board made a resolution that all elementaries would be named after state figures or icons in Goose Creek. Well, that didn't happen. That was about 20 years ago, so that just kind of proves the point that the current board has the power to name schools. And then there's 4 named after local figures or educators. Can we name one? Elementary? Okay, so Johnny Clark was a previous superintendent. There we go, Ben Willows. Also you have Hopper and Victoria Walker. Okay? So just looking at the spread of how schools are named at Goose Creek, that's the point of this exercise, which we're enjoying. There's 5 current junior schools. We're building a 6, so I want to show you those real quick. 3 named after locations or concept. Can you name one? Baytown Junior, the first junior school in Goose Creek. And we also have Silverado, also have Highlands. 1 was named after a national figure or icon, so kind of go through the list of junior schools. Horseman, Father of Education in America, I believe is his title. And then 0 named after state figures, and then 2 named after local figures. 1 is Gentry, previous superintendent, and the other one is in the process of being built, E.F. Green. Okay, then last for high schools, we got 7 high schools. Out of these 7 high schools, almost half of them are named after locations or concepts. All right, so I'll go ahead. You're sitting at one of them right now, Impact. So Impact is a concept rather than a person's name. You also have Goose Creek Memorial, and then you have Point, our alternative education program. Okay? You have 1 named after a national figure, Robert E. Lee. You have 1 named after a state figure, that's Sterling. And then you have 2 named after local figures or educators. Yes, Peter Hyland and John Stewart Ferguson. Okay? So the last thing I want to show you on this part before I hand it over to Dr. McCall to talk about our board policy, I get to do the fun stuff, and then he has to get to the weeds. I think it's interesting, it may be educational to look at how schools were named based off period of time. So this may be difficult to see. I should have blown up the font a little bit. But this is 1920 to 1940. So during those 20 years, you can see that 3 national schools were named, 4 state schools, and then 5 non-person, is what I'm going to call that. Local, none of the schools were named after a local entity at that time. During the 40s to 60s, you can see you have 3 state schools that were named, 1 non-person. 60s to 80s, you have 1 state, 2 local. 80s to 2000, you have 1 state, only 1 school was named at that time. We may have built schools during that time, but they may have carried the same name. So a new name emerged here. And then from 20 years past, 2001 to present, 6 or 5, 6 of the schools were named after a local entity, and then 3 were non-person. 0 were national, 0 were state. So the point of this is just to show you, based off the time period, you can see sort of the trend of how schools were named. Does that make sense? And to paint it a little clearer, if you look at just the national bar graph, all 3 of our national schools were named between 1920 and 1940. Okay? If you look at the state schools only, the schools named after a state figure, you can see sort of a downward trend, where in the 20s to the 60s, that was more of a popular name to name schools in Goose Creek and probably beyond. And then you can see in recent years, that's not necessarily the trend, or at least for our district, it's not the trend. You can see for non-person schools, you have a U-shaped graph where it was very popular early, in the 20s to 40s. And then we know a lot of state schools were named, and when I say state schools, I mean schools named after state figures. That happened between the 40s and the 80s. And then presently, we've had 3 schools recently named after non-individuals. And then last, schools named after local educators or local icons. You can see that's more of a current trend, where you don't see that happen at the beginning of this school district, but you do see it happen pop up a little bit. 2 schools from 1960 to 80, and then 5 schools or 6 schools in the last 20 years, okay? So the last thing I want to share with you real quick is talking about board policy. So a couple of things. The facilities are named based on board policy or board approval. So that's first of all how schools are named or renamed. There's a good chance that there's not a record of board policy, or there was not a board policy early in the school district. We have board minutes, so we have board minutes where you can read through the minutes of what was decided, but we don't necessarily know the written rules back in the 20s or the 30s. I reached out to TASB, the Texas Association of School Board, where they keep copies of board policy, and in my conversation with them, they had 2 revised policies for this specific board policy, CW local. And the policy basically was a very minor wording. It didn't change any decision, it was just a change in how it was written. And you're going to see that policy here in a second. I will say that there was a previous policy. I talked to Judy Craig. You may know Judy Craig in our district, a longstanding historian of Goose Creek. She knows Goose Creek very well. And she remembers that probably in the 80s or early 90s, there was a change to the board policy where at one time you could name a school building after a living person, and then that changed to the person that had to be deceased. And that's currently the policy that you'll see here in a little bit. Okay? I'm going to hand it over to Dr. McCall. He's going to talk a little bit about our current board policy, just so that you can see that. And again, this is background knowledge as we get into the committee's decision. Yes, sir.
I just want to make a quick point. It'd be interesting to see the breakdown also by like what kind of theme there was behind it. Because a lot of like the location and state names are more geared towards like Texas Revolution, and then some of the local names after educators versus locations. I mean, it's all location based. So I mean, there kind of was a trend there where a lot of names were after Texas Revolution, and you like ran out of them. There's only so many good names you can pull out of Texas Revolution.
That's true. You're digging deep into the bucket at some point. So, yes, and they're based off where we're located. And if you look at some of the location names, that those still fall under the state category. So San Jacinto would be an example of that. So, or Alamo would be an example of that. Correct.
Yeah, well, like when you made one earlier,
I just wanted to remind y'all, we're now in a new position. If y'all don't pass over the microphone, we can't hear in this room.
Okay, we sure will. So we will make sure we do that. Thank you.
Well, like Starling explained that for, he helped create our board. So it was a major key part of this history of the city of Macon.
Can you give him the microphone when you spoke? We're missing out on good
So I would say
dialogue.
like Starling is there, he helped create our board, which is a big part of this community.
All right, so as Mr. Bollinger stated, one of the tasks that this committee will have is potentially making recommendations to the board on considering a revision of the policy when it comes to naming facilities in the district. And so in order to help guide that work, we want to provide you the information on what our current board policy states. And so some of you may be familiar with it, but of course, if not, all of this information can be found on the board website on pccisd.net. So current board policy is CW local, and it reads, a district facility shall be named for a deceased person who has attained prominence locally and or nationally in the fields of education, science, art, statesmanship, political science, or military achievement, an early pioneer of the area encompassed by the district, the state of Texas, or an outstanding president of the United States. So that's what our current board policy reads as it relates to the naming of facilities in the district.
Can I ask, when did that go into effect?
I'll have to go back and take a look at that, but the board updates,
2012, it's on the bottom of
The last one.
thank you. I have to go back and take a look, but at the bottom, you can see the last time it was revised, 2012.
But that's just a
But it was in
revision.
place in 2012.
Right. Well, my question is, I mean, it's no good for, now, I could be wrong with the school, but didn't somehow or another Victoria Walker get slipped in? One of the schools, somebody wasn't deceased, and the school was named after her.
She was deceased, I believe, when
What
Victoria.
did she say?
She was stating that Victoria Walker,
Or another school, I can't remember exactly.
she's concerned, she was asking, is there a school that may have been named after someone that was not deceased after the policy had been changed to this? And so she mentioned Victoria Walker, and Mr. Bowler just stated that Victoria Walker was deceased at the time of the
Seemed
name.
like there was someone.
What about Johnny Clark?
He was deceased, passed away.
I believe those both were deceased, and I can research that this week to find that out. I'm not sure.
The one you're thinking is Hopper was still alive. Yeah.
So Hopper is what's being discussed, but that was in the 80s.
Yes, it was prior to that.
So it may have been prior to the revision of the policy. But we can certainly find out more information. When we're looking at the last time it was revised, it could be any part of the policy, so we have to look specifically for this part. Board policy CW local also reads, students and other citizens shall be called upon to nominate persons representing all cultures that may be considered in the naming of a district facility. And so it's my understanding that that was a part of, the push for E.F. Green Junior School. So citizens do have an opportunity to weigh in on the naming of facilities for individuals that meet the qualifications based on board policy. The following guidelines shall govern the naming of a district facility. The name of a living person shall not be considered. The nominee must have made a significant contribution to society or to the district. The name should lend prestige and status to an institution of learning. The nomination shall be presented in a brief 3-paragraph statement that shall contain A, biographical data, B, the significant contribution, C, a statement of why a school should be named after the person. The board may, at its discretion, name a portion of a building, such as a library or auditorium. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the entire building may be named after an individual, but it could be that a certain part of the building could be named. The board may, with a minimum of 5 affirmative votes, elect to name or rename an auxiliary facility without meeting the criteria above. So when we're talking about our auxiliary facilities, those are pretty much facilities where students are not housed. And so you're looking at, facilities such as your transportation facility, our maintenance and construction facilities. But that's the exception that's outlined here in the policy. When it comes to renaming facilities, in a situation deemed unusual or appropriate, the board may take steps to rename a district facility or a portion of that facility thereof. In such cases, an appropriate use of the former name shall be determined before the change is made. In renaming the facility or portion, the provisions set forth above shall be followed. Once again, in such cases, an appropriate use of the former name shall be determined before the change is made. In renaming the facility or portion, the provisions set forth above shall be followed. A recommendation for a name change shall be received by the administration anytime during the year and shall be referred to the board for obtaining comments and input from the school community involved. And so we had opportunities with that from comments from the public, but now we're in this committee also leading the charge to do that work. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question from like 3 slides back. When y'all were giving the CW local and you talked about the revision for 2012, either on the next meeting or in an email, can you please give us what it was prior to that? And the only reason I'm asking is because you were showing the themes of state local for every 20 to 40 years. So I would also like to see what the CW local said before it was revised as recent as 2012, just so I can also draw conclusions themes that are going on.
Sure, and what I'll take to that is that if you look at the policy from 2000 and then 2012, it's just a slight change of wording. There's not a change really in the essence or the meaning of the board policy. I'll let you read it for yourself,
Okay.
but there's really not a change. TASB does not have record of that policy for Goose Creek before 2000. And so so I'll dig a little bit more on the policy. Again, we keep board minutes, but usually the current policy is what's in place. But I can look into that to see if we can find that.
Okay, and then the last thing that I wanted to ask, with the questions that y'all are asking us to make a report on for the board, can you clarify, because you're reading the CW local and it says that even if we report all of the answers to these questions, am I right in saying that it says they have to at least reuse a portion of a name if they rename a facility?
No, ma'am. No,
Okay,
it's
so I want
just, you
clarification.
can, so for the purpose of renaming a facility, remember we talked about, it could be a library that may be named after someone. So it's a portion of that facility. If someone makes a recommendation or a committee makes a recommendation, they can consider the portion of the facility as well as the entire facility if they so choose.
So the part that says they have to reuse the name or a portion of a name, that's what it says.
Go back to the slide before.
Yeah, right there, where it says, it says appropriate use of the former name shall be determined. So if we got rid of, for example, Stephen F. Austin, is that board saying that we would have to reuse Austin at another facility?
I can answer that. The policy says, but the way that I interpret this is that the policy says that they should have that conversation. So if we're going to rename Stephen F. Austin, is there a better item or location or facility to place the name of Stephen F. Austin elsewhere? Could it be the name of Sterling Library, for example? So,
So what that also means is that before you rename a facility, you have to consider how the former name gets used, meaning do we eliminate Stephen F. Austin from every history book that Stephen F. Austin ever existed, or do we have to say Stephen F. Austin, now known as blah, blah, blah. So you have to, before you rename, you have to make a decision about how you reference the old, right? So there's that piece. The second piece, this piece of paper that has all of what he just read is all written in your folder, so you can not have to memorize what he read. But I also read that this implies that it has to be a person now.
no.
No, it's the urban.
So it can be named after geographical data.
No, it says person.
It's a person.
Shall be named for a deceased person who has attained blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, because GCM was in 2008, so it was before this. So you couldn't say Goose Creek Central, you couldn't say Goose Creek.
But isn't
United.
it true that the board made an exception for Goose Creek Memorial? Because according to this,
That's
it's
in
a person.
2008. It's
But Goose Creek Memorial was
4 years before.
2008, yeah. Thank you.
So that should be one of those revisions that we see as to where it went from.
So maybe that's what we're going to modify it.
In 2012. So now, according to 2012, you cannot name it after geographical area.
So just to make sure everyone heard, someone was asking about Goose Creek Memorial and why it has that name instead of the name of a person. And that's because Goose Creek Memorial was opened in 2008. This policy is from 2012.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, because the policy was still in place at that time, it's probably just not exact wording in the board policy. And so where it says person, I can tell you that several schools have been named since that policy was in existence that where it was not a person. Again, you're in a building. Impact was named based off the board's approval. That was not a person. So again, that may be something that as a committee, we want to go back and look at the wording and adjust that wording.
Right, so that's the exact question I had, because when you talked about concepts and locations, so if locations ended in 2008, then when did concepts end? Because you have impact and you have point, and other than the rest. And then the other point, what you were saying about auxiliary buildings, all of them except for one is called a transportation. So you have one, George D. John D. George Agri-Science Building, the same as our person. So there's not really consistency. It's kind of the Cliff Notes version of what we're saying,
What
right?
students are in that students use that facility. So although it's not your traditional school, students use that facility for agriculture education.
So for like the technology and transportation, you know, they use the bus, but they're not on the facility using the building?
Right, so in the technology center, we don't have classes and students
Got it.
there, or student programs going on there, or in the facilities maintenance and construction.
So wherever there's instruction,
Right.
that's where the name is.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
I just want to make one point real quick. I believe that the board would have discretion to override policy anytime by a majority vote. So even in a case where it says a minimum of 5 affirmative votes, the board could override that with a simple majority to say we don't need 5 votes to do something different. We do have to keep that in mind also here. So they could say we're not going to do it after a person. We're overriding policy in this case.
And I think it's important to also note that policy is one thing and practice is another thing. I can tell you that in other districts, just based off the circumstances or the situation, they have voted to suspend the policy for a special exception, whatever that exception may be. And so I know that that's happened before as well. So we can go through and look at what happened in the minutes for each facility and take the time to do that. And that'll tell you a little bit about what's going on, but you may not still get the full story because there's context behind what was going on at that time.
A lot of times that
Yes.
Goose Creek Memorial, there was a big, and I was on the school board for those schools that were, I was on the school board from 1999 to 2009, and I know Mike Wilson, I remember him on that committee for naming the high school, Goose Creek Memorial. And this was in place, just minor changes to it. And we all decided as a board, in closed session, I should be saying this, that we wanted to make it universal, so to speak. I may not be using the right word, but it was a few weeks for naming Goose Creek Memorial. It was a lot of national teeth for naming Goose Creek Memorial. So it was there. This was there.
Okay, I think we're going to go to our next agenda item. We're going to try to stay on time. We're about 5 minutes behind, so I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Fraley.
And again, as you think through this, the board is asking for your input, recommendations regarding any policy changes to name. So any ideas you have, please consider those. You have a copy of the current policy. Any recommendations that you have, jot those down, and you'll have a chance to present those to the group going forward. Quickly, last time we met, we used a tool called Thought Exchange. If we can get that link open up, I want to show you all kind of what it did. With some tremendously interesting data that we generated, that you all generated from there. We're going to try another round of them again tonight with another big important question. And, but you'll see that the big thing with this is how we facilitate the most inclusive manner possible, get as many ideas and thoughts as possible in front of you. Last time we had 38 participants who generated 50 thoughts. You each give them 5 minutes. You each give them 5 minutes to think about your comments, and then you submit those thoughts. And everyone had a chance to read those and respond to them. Now, if we pass the mic around and gave you each 5 minutes with the microphone, 38 from last time, that's 190 minutes. 190 minutes. So we're going to try again to look at how do we be as inclusive as possible, get as many thoughts and ideas from everyone, because everyone doesn't like to go on the microphone. And some folks like to take their time to think through things. And some folks are just a little shy, and sometimes some folks get the microphone and never let it go. So no one's just talking. All right, so we want to be very careful about that. So what we have up here also, if you go down and click up that bar, the themes, click on the themes. What we have identified, you identified with your comments and themes. And you click on, like on students, click on that, you have a total of 5 thoughts, and these are those thoughts everyone generated. So this report is in our possession to, and I think we can share the link. I'll confirm that and share the link So you can at least go back and look at all the different thoughts generated by the group and kind of the themes that were generated and where they are. Okay? So we're going to take a quick break and we're going to bring up Laura Miller again because we have another big question that we need as much input from you guys as possible. So let's take a quick 2-minute break or break.